The grandfather clock in Mary Peterson's living room hadn't chimed in 3 years. It stood silent in the corner of her modest Minneapolis home, its pendulum motionless behind dusty glass, frozen at 4:17. She couldn't remember if it was afternoon or morning when it stopped, just that it was the same day her youngest son, Michael, had last visited. He'd promised to get it fixed. "Next time, Mom, I'll bring my tools." But like the clock, that promise remained suspended in time. Mary sat in her worn leather armchair, the one her late husband Charles had spent countless Sunday afternoons in, watching football games and dozing off. The evening light filtered through lace curtains she'd hung 40 years ago, casting familiar shadows on the faded wallpaper. At 78, she found herself counting shadows instead of blessings. The house was too big for one person. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a finished basement where her children once played. Now it felt like a museum of abandoned memories. Photos lined the walls, graduation ceremonies, weddings, family vacations. 3 children who had grown up, grown successful, and grown distant. Sarah, the eldest, a cardiologist in Boston. James, the middle child, a tech executive in Seattle. And Michael, the baby of the family, a real estate developer just 40 minutes away in St. Paul. The irony wasn't lost on Mary that her children had all built careers around caring for hearts, building connections and developing homes, yet somehow had forgotten about the heart, connection, and home that had shaped their beginnings. She picked up her phone, a simplified model that Sarah had insisted she get for emergencies, and scrolled through her recent calls. The last incoming call from any of her children had been 2 months ago, a brief conversation with James about his need for her to sign some paperwork regarding the family trust. Before that, 3 unanswered calls to Sarah's office. Michael hadn't called since Christmas, when he'd left a voicemail saying he and his wife Jenny would be spending the holidays at Jenny's parents' vacation home in Aspen. The evening news droned on in the background, stories of world events that seemed increasingly distant from her shrinking world. A commercial for a retirement community played, showing smiling seniors playing cards and doing water aerobics. Mary had once suggested to her children that she might enjoy such a place, somewhere with people her age, activities, a community. Sarah had immediately dismissed it as too expensive. James had mumbled something about looking into it, and Michael had changed the subject entirely. A sharp pain in her hip reminded Mary it was time for her medication. She pushed herself up from Charles's chair, using the solid wooden arm for support. The walk to the kitchen seemed longer each day. The wooden floor creaked beneath her careful steps. Familiar sounds, a house growing old with its owner. The kitchen, once the heart of their family home, now felt too large, too empty. Where there had once been chaotic family dinners and holiday preparations, there was now only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and a single place setting at the corner of the oak table. She filled a glass with water and looked at the array of pills in her weekly organizer. The colors reminded her of the jelly beans she used to fill Easter baskets with. Pink for blood pressure, white for cholesterol, blue for arthritis. As she swallowed each pill, Mary thought about how her own mother had aged. They had lived just 3 blocks away, and Mary had visited every day, bringing her children along after school. Her mother had known her grandchildren's favorite foods, their fears, their dreams. She had been present for every milestone, every skinned knee, every triumph. Now, Mary's own grandchildren, 5 of them, were practically strangers. She knew their names and birthdays, but their lives were filtered through occasional Facebook posts that Sarah's husband sometimes remembered to share with her. The sound of a car door slamming outside made her heart leap. She shuffled to the living room window, pushing aside the lace curtain. It was just the neighbors, the Hendersons, returning from their weekly dinner out. Tom Henderson caught her eye and waved. Mary waved back, then let the curtain fall. The Hendersons had lived next door for 30 years, had watched her children grow up. Now they checked on her more often than her own flesh and blood. Mary's gaze fell on the antique secretary desk in the corner, where a stack of unopened envelopes lay. She had been avoiding them, knowing what they contained: medical bills, property tax notices, utility payments that kept creeping higher. Her teacher's pension and Social Security covered the basics, but the unexpected expenses were starting to overwhelm her. The roof needed repairs, the water heater was making strange sounds, and her arthritis medication's copay had doubled last month. She had tried to discuss her financial concerns with her children. Sarah had suggested she sell the house. "It's too big for you anyway, Mum." James had mentioned reverse mortgages. Michael, who had built his real estate empire starting with the seed money his father had left him, had been suspiciously quiet on the subject. The truth was, Mary didn't want to sell. This house wasn't just a property to leverage or an asset to liquidate. It was where Charles had carried her over the threshold in 1965. It was where she had nursed each of her babies in the middle of the night, where she had helped with countless homework assignments at the kitchen table, where she had welcomed her children and their spouses after their weddings. It was where Charles had spent his final days, insisting on remaining at home rather than in a hospital, holding her hand until the very end. A loud knock at the front door startled her from her reverie. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. But no, her children never knocked. They had keys, though they rarely used them. She made her way to the door, checking through the peephole as Charles had always insisted. It was Angela, the social worker from Lutheran Social Services. Mary had been resistant when Tom Henderson had first suggested she meet with someone, but Angela had proved to be a quiet comfort over the past few months. She opened the door. "Good evening, Mary," Angela smiled warmly. She was carrying her usual leather portfolio and what looked like a bag of groceries. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything?" The question itself was a kindness. They both knew there was nothing to interrupt. Mary stepped aside to let her in, noticing how Angela's eyes swept the entryway, professionally assessing, looking for signs of decline or neglect. "I brought some soup from that deli you mentioned liking," Angela said, heading toward the kitchen with familiar ease. "And I thought we could look over those assistance programs we discussed last time." Mary followed her to the kitchen, watching as the younger woman efficiently unpacked the bag. Soup, yes, but also fresh fruit, a loaf of bread, and some prepackaged meals. All the things Mary found increasingly difficult to shop for on her own since giving up driving last year. "You don't need to do this," Mary protested weakly, even as her stomach reminded her that she had skipped lunch again, finding the effort of cooking for one person increasingly pointless. Angela paused in her unpacking, fixing Mary with a gentle but firm look. "Everyone needs help sometimes, Mary. That's why I'm here. Now, shall we heat up some of this soup and talk about what's been happening since last week?" As Angela moved around her kitchen with professional efficiency, Mary sank into a chair at the table. She watched this stranger care for her with more attention than her own children had shown in years, and felt something inside her crack. A tear slid down her cheek, then another. "I don't understand," she whispered, more to herself than to Angela. "I gave them everything. Where did I go wrong?" Angela stopped what she was doing and sat down across from Mary, reaching out to take her trembling hand. "You didn't go wrong, Mary. Sometimes life takes turns we don't expect. But you're not alone. We're going to figure this out together." The words were kind, professional, practiced, but they were also the first words of real comfort Mary had heard in longer than she could remember. As the autumn evening settled around her quiet house, as her children lived their busy lives in distant cities, Mary Peterson began to tell her story to a stranger who cared enough to listen. She told Angela about Charles, about their love story that had started at a teacher's college dance in 1963, about the tough early years when they were both teaching, saving every penny to buy this house, about the joy of bringing each baby home, the years of PTA meetings and soccer games and band concerts, about Charles's illness, the way their children had seemed to pull away even then, making excuses about work and distance and their own family's needs. As she spoke, Mary felt something shifting inside her, a recognition that perhaps it was time to stop waiting for her children to remember she existed. Perhaps it was time to learn how to exist without them. The grandfather clock stood silent in the corner, its hands still marking that long-ago moment when promises had been made and broken. But as Mary talked and Angela listened, and the soup simmered on the stove, time began to move forward again in its own way. What Mary didn't know, couldn't know, was that this evening marked the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about family, love, and survival. As she sat in her kitchen with a stranger who showed more care than her own children, events were already in motion that would force her family to confront the consequences of their abandonment and would test Mary's resilience in ways she never imagined. The soup began to bubble on the stove, and Angela rose to tend to it. Outside, the streetlights were coming on, casting long shadows across Mary's carefully tended garden. Somewhere in Boston, Seattle, and St. Paul, her children were living their lives, unaware that their mother was about to stop living in the shadow of their absence. Change was coming, ready or not. The fall came suddenly, like most life-changing moments do. Mary was reaching for her mother's china teapot on the top shelf, the one she'd been saving for when her daughters-in-law might visit, when her hip gave out. The shattering of the teapot against the kitchen floor was followed by a deeper silence, broken only by Mary's shallow breathing as she lay among the broken pieces. She wasn't sure how long she remained there before Mrs. Henderson heard her calls for help through the kitchen window. The next few hours passed in a blur of EMT voices, fluorescent hospital lights, and doctors' concerned faces. It wasn't until she was settled in a hospital room that reality began to crystallize. A broken hip, surgery required, and no family present to make decisions. "We've been trying to reach your children, Mrs. Peterson," the nurse said, checking Mary's IV. "We've left messages, but they're very busy," Mary finished, staring at the ceiling. "Important jobs, you know. Saving hearts, building empires." The nurse's hand paused on Mary's arm, a moment of understanding passing between them. It was Angela who arrived first, brandishing her social worker's credentials and a determination that seemed to grow with each unanswered call to Mary's children. It took 16 hours for the first of Mary's children to respond. Sarah's voice came through the hospital room phone, professional and controlled. "Mom, I'm in the middle of a crucial trial for a new cardiac procedure. I can't possibly get away right now. Have you called Michael? He's right there in St. Paul." Michael's response came via text message. "In Denver, closing a big deal. Can't talk. Keep me posted." James didn't respond at all. The surgery couldn't wait for family consensus. Angela helped Mary navigate the consent forms, her hand steady as she signed away permission for strangers to piece her body back together, while her children remained scattered across the country, too busy to witness their mother's vulnerability. The surgery was successful, but recovery would be complex. "You can't go back to that house alone," Dr. Roberts said firmly. "You'll need rehabilitation, then significant support at home. Or we can discuss care facilities." The word facility hung in the air like a sentence. Mary thought of the silent grandfather clock, the garden she'd tended for 40 years, Charles's chair holding the impression of all their shared evenings. "I want to go home," she said quietly. Angela cleared her throat. "Actually, I've been making some calls. There's a program through Lutheran Social Services, home healthcare workers, meal delivery, physical therapy at home. But Mary," she hesitated, "it's not covered by Medicare. We'd need to discuss financial options." Financial options. Mary knew what that meant. The house, her home, her history, her last connection to Charles would need to be leveraged or sold. She closed her eyes, remembering Sarah's casual suggestion about selling, James's mention of reverse mortgages. Had they been planning this all along? The rehabilitation facility was clean, efficient, and soulless. Mary spent 3 weeks watching other patients receive daily visitors, spouses, children, grandchildren bearing flowers and home-cooked meals. Her room remained flower-free, the only break in monotony being Angela's visits and the daily physical therapy sessions that left her exhausted and aching. It was during one of these sessions that she received the call from James. "Mom, I've been talking with Sarah and Michael. We think it's time to be practical about the house." Mary gripped the parallel bars she was meant to be walking between. "Practical? We've found a buyer. Actually, it's one of Michael's development partners. They're willing to make a cash offer well above market value. The neighborhood's changing, Mom. They're planning to build luxury condos." The parallel bars swam before her eyes. "You're selling my house? Without asking me? Mom, be reasonable. You can't live there alone anymore. The buyer's offering 20% above market. That's enough to keep you comfortable in a good facility for years. Michael's already drawn up the paperwork. We just need your signature." The physical therapist reached out to steady Mary as she swayed. "I need to call you back," she managed to say, ending the call with trembling fingers. That night, alone in her rehabilitation room, Mary did something she'd never done before. She got angry. Not the fleeting frustration she'd felt at her children's absences, not the quiet hurt of forgotten birthdays and hollow promises. This was a deep, righteous anger that started in her core and radiated outward until her whole body hummed with it. She called Angela. "They can't sell your house without your consent," Angela assured her after listening to the whole story. "But Mary, we need to act fast. I have some contacts, an elder law attorney who works pro bono, a financial advisor who specializes in seniors' rights. Are you ready to fight?" Mary thought of Charles, of his quiet strength and the lessons he'd taught their children about integrity. Lessons that apparently hadn't stuck. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm ready to fight." The next morning, Michael arrived at the rehabilitation facility, the first time any of her children had appeared in person since her fall. He carried a leather portfolio filled with documents, his face set in the smooth, professional mask he used for business deals. "Mom," he started, pulling up a chair. "I know this is hard, but you have to understand." "No, Michael," Mary interrupted, surprising them both. "You need to understand. This isn't a business deal. This is my home. Your home, once. Where you took your first steps. Where your father spent his last days." "Mom, please. This is a great offer. The market might not stay this hot. We're trying to help." "Help?" The word tasted bitter. "Like you helped when I needed my medication picked up last month? Like you helped when the roof was leaking? Like you helped when I spent Christmas alone?" Michael's face flushed. "That's not fair. We have our own lives, our own families. And I have mine," Mary said quietly. "Or I thought I did. Get out, Michael." "Mom, get out of my room. And tell your siblings that if any of you try to sell my house out from under me, I'll go to every newspaper in the Twin Cities. How would that look for the developer who built his empire by stealing his mother's home?" After Michael left, Mary's hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial Angela's number. But when the social worker answered, Mary's voice was steady. "I need that lawyer you mentioned, and then I need you to help me make some changes to my will." The rehabilitation facility's social worker appeared in the doorway as Mary ended the call. "Mrs. Peterson, you have some visitors. They say they're from the neighborhood association." Tom and Betty Henderson entered, followed by 3 other familiar faces from the block. Betty was carrying a folder thick with papers. "Mary," Tom said gravely, "we heard what your kids are trying to do. We've taken a vote. The association is filing an official protest against any rezoning requests for your property. And Betty here has some interesting information about historical preservation status for homes in our district." For the first time since her fall, Mary felt something like hope. As her neighbors pulled up chairs, as Betty spread out documents showing how they could protect her home from development, Mary realized something profound. Sometimes the family you need isn't the family you were born with. The grandfather clock might be silent in her empty house, but time was still moving, and Mary Peterson was done simply letting it pass her by. Let her children think she was a helpless old woman. They were about to learn that their mother still had some fight left in her. What none of them knew was that the battle over Mary's house was just the beginning. The coming weeks would test not just Mary's resolve, but the very definition of family itself. As she sat in her rehabilitation room, surrounded by neighbors who had become more like family than her own children, Mary felt the first stirrings of a revolution, not just for herself, but for every parent who had ever been discarded by the children they raised. The sun was setting outside her window, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot. Somewhere in their expensive homes and busy lives, her children were probably congratulating themselves on finding a solution to their mother problem. They had no idea what was coming. The media storm broke on a Tuesday. Sarah was in the middle of a consultation when her nurse interrupted with an urgent message. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune was running a front-page story. Abandoned mother fights developer son over family home. The accompanying photo showed Mary in her wheelchair outside the rehabilitation facility, surrounded by members of the neighborhood association, her face set in quiet determination. Within hours, the story went viral. Local news stations picked it up first, then national outlets. Prominent doctor, tech exec, and developer siblings attempt to seize elderly mother's home, read one headline. American dream to American nightmare. Children plot to evict 78-year-old mother, proclaimed another. Mary hadn't sought the publicity. Betty Henderson's daughter, a journalism student at the University of Minnesota, had heard the story during a Sunday dinner and recognized its significance. With Mary's quiet permission, she had written the initial article, complete with historical photographs of the neighborhood, documentation of Michael's development company's previous projects, and quotes from elderly advocates about the growing crisis of senior abandonment in America. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Protesters appeared outside Michael's office in St. Paul, carrying signs with enlarged photos of Mary at their children's weddings. Sarah's hospital received so many angry calls that they had to issue a statement distancing themselves from the controversy. James's tech company's stock took a hit as social media erupted with calls for boycotts. "What have you done?" Sarah's voice trembled with fury when she finally called. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to us? My hospital board is questioning my position." "I raised you better than this," Mary replied simply, and hung up. The elder law attorney Angela had found Patricia Ramirez proved to be a force of nature. She filed emergency injunctions, contacted state authorities about potential elder abuse, and began building a case that went far beyond Mary's individual situation. "Your story has touched a nerve," Patricia explained during one of their strategy sessions. "We're hearing from elderly parents across the country facing similar situations. This isn't just about your house anymore, Mary. This is about a generational betrayal." Mary hadn't wanted to become a symbol. She had simply wanted to live out her days in the home where she had raised her family. But as letters began pouring in from other abandoned parents, as social workers and elder advocates reached out to share similar stories, she realized she had stumbled into a fight bigger than herself. The neighborhood association transformed her house into a fortress of support. They organized shifts to maintain the property, planted her garden with fall flowers, and documented every attempt by Michael's development partners to pressure or intimidate them. Tom Henderson installed security cameras after suspicious cars were seen photographing the house. Then came the leak that changed everything. Emails between Michael and his siblings discussing their mother's situation, dating back 2 years. James's tech expertise hadn't been enough to protect their private correspondence from determined journalists. "Mom's sitting on prime real estate," Michael had written. "The longer we wait, the more likely she'll need expensive care. Better to move her into a facility now and liquidate while the market's hot." Sarah's response had been equally damning. "Agreed. She's not safe alone anyway. We can present it as concern for her welfare." James, usually the quiet one, had added, "The trust gives us legal authority if she becomes incapacitated. Worth considering." The emails made national news. Corporate boards demanded responses. Michael's development partners distanced themselves from the project. James's company faced shareholder questions about ethics and leadership. Mary watched it all unfold from her rehabilitation room, where she was growing stronger each day. The physical therapists commented on her renewed determination during their sessions. "Nothing heals the body like fighting spirit," one observed. Angela visited daily, bringing updates and managing the growing support network that had sprung up around Mary's cause. "They're calling it the Mary Peterson Law now," she said one evening. "There's talk of legislation to protect elderly homeowners from predatory family members." "I never wanted to hurt them," Mary said quietly, looking out her window at the gathering crowd of supporters below. "They're still my children." "They hurt themselves," Angela replied gently. "You just refuse to be a victim." The confrontation, when it came, was both unexpected and inevitable. All three of her children arrived at the rehabilitation facility unannounced one Sunday afternoon. They found Mary sitting in the facility's garden, surrounded by a group of other residents who had become her unofficial support group. "Mom," Sarah began, her professional composure cracking. "We need to talk, privately." Mary looked at her children, really looked at them, for the first time in years. Sarah, her white coat replaced by casual clothes, dark circles under her eyes. James, his tech mogul, confidence shattered, fidgeting like the nervous boy he'd once been. Michael, his real estate empire crumbling, looking older than she'd ever seen him. "Anything you have to say," Mary replied clearly. "You can say in front of my friends. They're the ones who've been here for me." "This has to stop," Michael burst out. "The protests, the media, the legal threats. You're destroying everything we've built." "Everything you built," Mary corrected him quietly. "On the foundation of the home your father and I gave you. The education we sacrificed for. The values we thought we taught you." "We were trying to help," Sarah's voice rose. "You can't live alone anymore. You need care." "I do need care," Mary agreed. "I needed it when your father was dying. I needed it last Christmas. I needed it when the roof was leaking and when I couldn't drive anymore. Where were you then?" The silence that followed was deafening. "The problem," Mary continued, her voice gaining strength, "isn't that I need care now. The problem is that you saw me as a problem to solve instead of a mother to love. You saw my home as an asset to liquidate instead of the place where you became who you are." "What do you want?" James asked, speaking for the first time. "What will it take to end this?" Mary looked at each of them in turn, these successful strangers who had once been her babies. "I want you to remember who you are. Not the doctor, the tech executive, the developer. The children your father and I raised to be better than this." She gestured to the facility around them. "I'm getting stronger every day. I'm going home soon. My home. Not a facility you choose for me. What happens next is up to you. You can continue fighting me, watching your reputations and careers crumble. Or you can remember that you're my children and start acting like it." A nurse appeared at the garden door. "Mrs. Peterson, your attorney is here with some papers for you to sign." Mary gripped her walker and stood, stronger than she'd been in weeks. "I have to go now. When you're ready to be my children again, really ready, not just crisis management ready, you know where to find me. I'll be in the house where you grew up, waiting to see if the lessons your father and I taught you still mean anything." She moved past them slowly but steadily, leaving them standing in the garden as the autumn leaves fell around them. Behind her, she heard Sarah begin to cry. Later that evening, as Angela helped her review the latest legal documents, Mary's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from James. "Do you remember when Dad used to fix the grandfather clock every spring? I think I still have his old tools." Mary stared at the message for a long moment, then showed it to Angela. "Is this progress?" she asked. Angela squeezed her hand. "It's a start. Sometimes that's all you can ask for." Outside, the sun was setting on another day of this unexpected battle. Mary Peterson, who had never sought to become a symbol or start a movement, watched the colors fade from the sky and thought about second chances. They didn't always come in the form you expected. Sometimes they came disguised as battles you never wanted to fight. Spring came to Minneapolis like a long-held breath finally released. Mary sat in Charles's old chair, watching through the living room window as Tom Henderson helped James with the grandfather clock. Her son's movements were careful, deliberate, as he referenced an old manual he'd found in his father's belongings. The past 6 months had rewritten everything. The Mary Peterson law had passed in Minnesota, with similar legislation pending in 12 other states. Her story had sparked a national conversation about elder abandonment and family obligations. But more importantly, it had forced her own children to confront the people they'd become. Sarah had taken a sabbatical from her hospital, citing family obligations. She'd spent the first month helping Mary transition home, sleeping in her old bedroom, relearning the rhythms of her mother's life. They'd fought. Decades of hurt don't heal overnight. But they'd also talked, really talked, for the first time in years. James had moved his company's headquarters back to Minneapolis, buying a house just 10 minutes away. He came by every Sunday, like clockwork, usually bearing tech gadgets Mary didn't need but appreciated for the thought behind them. He'd also set up a foundation in Charles's name, providing home care assistance for elderly residents who wanted to age in place. Michael's transformation had been the most dramatic. The development company had collapsed under the scandal, forcing him to rebuild from scratch. His new venture focused on renovating existing homes to be elder-friendly, preserving neighborhoods instead of demolishing them. He'd started with Mary's house, personally overseeing the installation of safety features and accessibility modifications. The clock's mechanism made a promising sound. "I think we've got it, Mom," James called over his shoulder. He and Tom Henderson stepped back as the pendulum began to swing, its gentle rhythm filling the room for the first time in years. Mary closed her eyes, remembering Charles's hands on that same mechanism, teaching a young James about gears and timing. When she opened them, her son was watching her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Dad would be proud of you," she said softly. "Not for fixing the clock, for fixing yourself." The doorbell rang before James could respond. It was Sarah and Michael arriving for their weekly family dinner. Sarah carried grocery bags. She'd discovered a passion for cooking during her sabbatical, while Michael held his infant daughter, Mary's first grandchild to be born since the reconciliation. "The clock," Sarah exclaimed, setting down her bags. "You actually fixed it." "Tom helped," James said, nodding to their neighbor. "Turns out I needed a little guidance." "Story of our lives," Michael murmured, adjusting his daughter in his arms. The baby, named Charlotte after Charles, gurgled happily. Tom Henderson made his exit gracefully, but not before Mary caught his hand. "Thank you," she said, meaning far more than just the clock repair. "That's what neighbors are for," he replied simply. "Betty's making her apple pie for tomorrow's neighborhood association meeting. You're still coming?" Mary nodded. The monthly meetings, once focused on protecting her home, had evolved into a community support network for elderly residents. She'd found her voice there, speaking up for others who faced similar struggles. As Tom left, her children moved through the house with growing familiarity. Sarah to the kitchen, beginning dinner preparations. James adjusting the clock's chimes. Michael settling on the floor with Charlotte, surrounded by the same toys he'd once played with, preserved in Mary's hope of grandchildren visiting. The house felt different now, no longer a museum of abandoned memories, but a living, breathing home again. Different from when the children were young, different from her years alone with Charles, different from her lonely days after his death, but alive. Angela visited less frequently these days, her professional duties reduced to occasional check-ins. "You've become quite the celebrity in elder rights circles," she'd said during her last visit. "They want you to speak at conferences." Mary had declined the speaking engagements. Her revolution had been personal, not political. She'd fought not for fame or legal change, but for the simple right to age with dignity in her own home, surrounded by the family she'd never stopped loving, even when they'd forgotten how to love her back. The grandfather clock struck 5, its chimes echoing through the house for the first time in years. In the kitchen, Sarah called out that dinner was almost ready. James began setting the table, all the places filled now, no longer a single setting in the corner. Michael rose from the floor, Charlotte in his arms, crossing to where Mary sat in Charles's chair. "Here, Mum," he said softly. "Hold your granddaughter while I help with dinner." Mary took the baby, breathing in that eternal newborn scent. Charlotte grabbed her finger with surprising strength, and Mary remembered doing this with each of her children, marveling at the grip of new life. "Your grandfather sat in this chair," she told Charlotte softly. "He would rock your daddy here when he was just as small as you. And someday, you'll tell your own children about the grandfather you never met, and the grandmother who fought to be here to hold you." The baby cooed, uncomprehending but content. From the kitchen came the sounds of her children working together, their voices mixed with laughter and the clink of dishes. The clock ticked steadily in its corner, marking time not as a reminder of absence, but as a measure of renewal. Mary Peterson sat in her home, her family restored if not quite the same, and listened to the symphony of second chances. Outside, spring flowers bloomed in the garden she'd tended for 40 years. Inside, the wounds of abandonment were healing, slowly but surely, like bones knitting back together after a break. The grandfather clock struck the quarter hour, its chime clear and true. In the kitchen, Sarah called everyone to dinner. Mary stood, still holding Charlotte, and made her way to the table where her children waited. "I love you, Mom," Michael said as he took his daughter back, kissing Mary's cheek. "I know," she replied simply. "I always did. I just needed you to remember that you loved me too." They gathered around the table, this patchwork family pieced back together by crisis and choice. The clock ticked in the corner, steady as a heartbeat, counting not the hours of abandonment, but the moments of redemption. Mary looked at her children, the doctor, the tech executive, the developer, now simply her daughter and sons again, and offered the blessing she'd said over countless family dinners. "For food, for family, for second chances, we give thanks." And in that moment, as her children bowed their heads over the table where they'd grown up, Mary knew that while not all abandoned parents would find such healing, her story might light the way for others. Not just through laws and social changes, but through the simple, powerful reminder that it's never too late to remember who you are, where you came from, and what family really means. The grandfather clock chimed the half hour, its voice strong and clear, keeping time for whatever chapters came next.